It is everywhere and has been for so long that most people no longer really see it. A white lower half, a deep red crown, a small gilded emblem fixed at the center of the label, a souvenir of a prize won in Paris at the dawn of the 20th century. The can has survived world wars, supermarket revolutions, suburban Thanksgiving rituals, and the rise of pop art, with its face almost unchanged. Warhol made it immortal in galleries. American kitchens made it ordinary. That combination is rarer than it looks. Few objects have moved so effortlessly between pantry shelf and cultural altar. Fewer still conceal, beneath so familiar a design, a family story this severe, because the Campbell's can is not merely a product. It is the public mask of an American dynasty, built by a chemist who entered the company on a wage so small it sounded temporary, then died owning all of it. It is the marker of a fortune so immense that two states fought, in court and in public, over which one had the right to tax his death. It is the emblem of a grandson who, facing the old arithmetic of inheritance, crossed the Atlantic, put money into Irish soil, and formally severed himself from the country that had made his name possible. And it is still, even now, the crest of a bloodline dispersed across continents, bound together by wealth, trustees, board seats, and an instruction written nearly a century ago: do not sell. So this is not, in the end, a story about condensed soup. It is a story about dynasty in the American style, quiet, disciplined, lit from the front, shadowed underneath, about what happens when a single invention does not merely enrich a family, but begins to govern it for generations ahead. The empire began without ceremony. In 1869, in Camden, New Jersey, a produce dealer named Joseph Campbell and a manufacturer of ice chests, Abraham Anderson, opened a modest preserving business in a city of wharves, smoke, and practical ambition. They packed what the market would take: tomatoes, vegetables, jams, minced meat goods, meant not for glamour but for pantry shelves and working kitchens. Nothing about the enterprise suggested dynasty. It was a useful business in an industrial town. No more. Anderson departed after only a few years. Campbell remained until retirement nearly a quarter century later. By then, the firm had passed into the hands of Arthur Dorrance, a capable executive who kept the business sound. Under his supervision, the company turned a respectable profit, selling canned produce through regional channels, and, in 1895, introducing a ready-to-serve soup line that performed well enough to justify its existence, but not well enough to hint at immortality. Then the nephew arrived. John Thompson Dorrance was born in Bristol, Pennsylvania, in 1873, into a family comfortable enough to educate talent instead of merely feeding it. He was brilliant, impatient, and drawn not to commerce but to chemistry. He studied at MIT, then crossed the Atlantic for doctoral work in Germany, where scientific training was treated with a rigor American universities admired. Europe did more than educate him. It gave him a market to observe. In Paris, moving through restaurants and dining rooms, he noticed what Americans had not yet fully embraced. Soup, there was not incidental. It was embedded in the daily rhythm of eating. In the United States, prepared soup remained cumbersome, too expensive for frequent use, too heavy to transport efficiently, too wasteful in the way it was manufactured and sold. Dorrance saw not a culinary difference, but a structural failure. If the product could be made smaller, cheaper, and easier to distribute, the country might learn to treat soup as Europe did, not as a novelty, but as habit. When he finished his doctorate, the respectable path lay open before him. Universities offered him posts. He turned it all down. Instead, he went to Camden and asked his uncle for a place inside the plant. Arthur Dorrance had doubts. The nephew looked like a man designed for scholarship, not canning lines. He seemed overqualified, perhaps too refined for the repetitive realities of industrial food production. But John insisted. He would work for a salary so low it bordered on insult. He would finance his own laboratory equipment. He wanted only the chance to test an idea, That concession altered the course of consumer history. Inside the Camden factory, Dorrance built a laboratory and applied a chemist's logic to a domestic inconvenience. Prepared soup, as it was then sold, came in large containers that were mostly liquid. Water made the cans bulky, expensive to manufacture, expensive to ship, and costly to store. The absurdity was obvious once someone with technical imagination bothered to see it. Why transport water across the country only to have the customer pour it into a pot? Dorrance's answer was concentration. Reduce the soup to its essential form, preserve the flavor and nourishment, and let the buyer restore it at home. It was simple, almost severe in its elegance. By removing what did not need to be there, he could reduce the size of the container, slash freight costs, increase shelf efficiency, and bring the retail price within reach of ordinary households. The condensed formula worked. Within a short span, Campbell's tomato soup reached stores in its reduced form and sold with startling speed. The appeal was not only culinary, it was financial. The can asked less of the shopper, less of the grocer, less of the railroad, less of the warehouse. By the first years of the new century, the line had multiplied into a broad range of varieties, each priced low enough to encourage repetition rather than hesitation. Dorrance had not merely improved a food product, he had re-engineered its economics. He also understood, with the instinct of a future monopolist, that empires are remembered by their silhouettes. In the late 1890s, the label changed to the now iconic pairing of deep red and white, a decision prompted, improbably enough, by colors seen at a college football game. The choice was accidental in origin and extraordinary in consequence. It gave the product a visual authority that would outlive executives, factories, and advertising generations. Soon after, at the Paris Exposition of 1900, the company won a medal for the quality of its soup. Dorrance placed that emblem on the label, where it became less a record of achievement than a permanent claim to prestige. By 1904, Grace Drayton's Campbell Kids had given the brand a softer public face, a nursery door charm that concealed the harder intelligence behind the enterprise. Because while the public saw charm, Dorrance was consolidating control. He rose quickly director, vice president, then the indispensable mind inside the company, and he used his growing wealth with a single-mindedness bordering on obsession. He bought stock whenever he could, from his uncle and from anyone else willing to part with it. Everyone understood the leverage, whether or not it was ever spoken aloud. The formulas were his. The process was his. The company's future prosperity rested on methods he had devised. If blocked, he could leave, establish a rival concern, and wound the original beyond repair. So the shares moved, one parcel at a time, toward the man who had made himself impossible to replace. By the time Arthur Dorrance retired in 1914, the transfer of authority had occurred in substance. The next year, John bought out the remaining Campbell interest and became sole owner of the company, whose destiny he had rewritten from inside a factory laboratory. He had entered at a wage fit for a clerk and emerged master of an enterprise that was reshaping how America stocked its kitchens, fed its families, and imagined convenience itself. He was 42 years old. The fortune was only beginning to gather. By 1904, Campbell had ceased to be merely a canning concern and was becoming a system of control. What had once been a tidy regional business, packing tomatoes, jellies, and other practical goods for nearby markets, was now sending out 16 million cans of soup a year. The number mattered, but the mentality mattered more. John T. Dorrance was stripping the company down to its central conviction. He had no patience for side businesses or product lines that diluted attention. Preserves, relishes, condiments, pickled goods, anything that distracted from the larger ambition was pushed aside. He did not want Campbell to be versatile. He wanted it to be dominant. Soup would not simply be one offering among many. It would be the company's identity, its discipline, its national claim. That kind of clarity often looks inevitable in retrospect. In real time, it can resemble obsession. Dorrance believed that concentration was a form of power, Do one thing, perfect it, scale it, then make it impossible to ignore. The company would produce soup better than anyone else, distribute it more efficiently than anyone else, and place its name so deeply into American domestic life that the purchase would become reflexive. It was a business strategy, certainly, but it was also the beginning of something more dynastic, the shaping of a private order around a single commodity. In 1906, he married Ethel Malincrot in Baltimore, linking himself to a prominent Maryland family and stepping more fully into the social architecture of the Eastern establishment. There would be 5 children in all, 4 daughters, and, later, a son. The household grew, the fortune widened. The circles around him became grander and more polished. But Dorrance himself never quite became ornamental. He was not one of those rich men who mistook possession for achievement. He lived inside the machinery of the business with unnerving intensity, appearing at the plant before sunrise, involving himself in matters both strategic and minute, from seed selection on company farms to the phrasing of ad copy on a streetcar card. Wealth gave him access to society. Work remained his governing habit. The expansion westward proved that his instincts were not provincial. In 1911, Campbell reached California, a formidable feat in an era when food distribution across the continent still depended on timing, rail coordination, warehouse discipline, and a tolerance for risk. To move a perishable consumer product across 3,000 miles and deliver it reliably was not just good management, it was industrial choreography. Campbell was becoming one of the first food companies in the United States to think and operate on a truly national scale. That mattered because Dorrance understood something fundamental about American power. The firms that endure are the ones that train the country to expect them everywhere. A year later, he tightened his grip further by moving backward into agriculture. If soup depended on tomatoes, then tomatoes themselves had to be brought under supervision. Campbell began growing part of its own supply, treating farming not as a romantic adjunct, but as a manufacturing problem in an earlier stage. Dorrance wanted consistency from the field to the finished can. During harvest season, the plant bent itself almost entirely toward the processing of tomatoes into soup and juice. The rhythm was monastic, even severe. Everything else waited. In 1915, he made another characteristic move. He acquired the Franco-American Food Company, one of the earliest commercial soup producers in the country. It was not an act of nostalgia, and it was not a rescue mission. Dorrance did not purchase competitors in order to preserve their legacy. He purchased them to remove them. Franco-American's value lay in its infrastructure, its market access, its usefulness inside a larger design. Its soup identity was gradually absorbed. Its name was redirected elsewhere. This was how empires grow when sentiment is not allowed in the boardroom. By 1922, the corporate name itself had been revised. No longer the Joseph Campbell Company, it became the Campbell Soup Company. The change was small in form and enormous in implication. It declared, with austere confidence, that the firm had chosen its place in American life and intended to keep it. This was no longer a broad canning house with varied interests. It was a soup empire, openly and unapologetically so. By the late 1920s, it was selling more soup than any company in the world. The line had broadened, but the architecture remained intact. Standardized product, recognizable can, accessible price. Around Dorrance, honors accumulated board seats, scientific memberships, international distinctions, the manners of prestige that gather around men who have converted invention into wealth. By any conventional measure, he had succeeded beyond reason, and that, as it so often does in old American dynasties, was the precise moment when success began quietly preparing its hidden invoice at last. By 1925, John Thompson Dorrance had reached the stage of American wealth where money no longer altered life so much as the scale of its surroundings. Campbell's Soup was now sold across the nation. The business had moved beyond success into dominance, and the fortune accumulating around it had become too large for ordinary gestures. So Dorrance did what many men of new money eventually do when they begin measuring themselves against older names. He bought an estate. It was called Woodcrest, and it stood on 238 acres in Radnor Township along Philadelphia's main line, that corridor where banking fortunes, railroad fortunes, and inherited fortunes had spent decades arranging themselves into a landscape of stone houses, clipped hedges, and social certainty. Woodcrest was not merely large, it was credentialed. The house, a 51-room Elizabethan and Tudor mansion of stone, limestone trim, and half-timbered wings, had been designed by Horace Trumbauer, the architect favored by Philadelphia's grandest families. Trumbauer had built for dynasties that did not need to announce themselves. Their names already did the work. The house had originally been commissioned for James W. Paul Jr., a Drexel partner by marriage and class, the kind of man for whom an estate on the main line was proof of belonging. Dorrance paid roughly $1 million for the property, including its furnishings and alterations, and then refashioned it to suit his own taste. The darker Victorian interiors were removed in favor of something lighter, cleaner, more in keeping with the cultivated restraint wealth prefers, once it no longer needs to shout. Upstairs were rooms enough for family, guests, children, nurses, and servants. Elsewhere on the grounds stood the necessary outbuildings of a serious estate: a stable, a pool house, a milk house, a cow barn, garages for multiple cars. It was not a house in the ordinary sense. It was an ecosystem of service, status, and insulation. On the 14th of November, 1925, the Dorrance family moved in. The transfer was complete and unmistakable. Their belongings came over from New Jersey. Their children entered local schools. Their routines, friendships, and obligations shifted to Pennsylvania. This was not a seasonal migration or a gentleman's country refuge. It was a full relocation into the geography of privilege. 16 servants worked inside the house. Another army maintained the grounds. Ethel Dorrance, who had spent years waiting for private wealth to acquire public standing, embraced the role expected of a woman in possession of such a property. She gave teas and garden parties that appeared in the society columns. When their eldest daughter made her debut, the event was treated as a matter of notice. The family had entered the world of established display, but arrival, in old money America, often has a second script running beneath the first. Dorrance understood that estates were not only places to live, they were also jurisdictions, and jurisdictions had tax laws. Pennsylvania taxed inherited wealth more heavily than New Jersey. That difference mattered when the fortune in question had climbed past $100 million. If he died as a Pennsylvania resident, the cost to his heirs would be immense. So even as he transplanted his family, his servants, and his daily life to the main line, he preserved another address across the river in Cinnaminson, New Jersey, and insisted that this property remained his true home. The contrast was almost indecent. Woodcrest was a grand mainline estate, built for a Drexel connection. Cinnaminson was a plain brick house on a few acres near truck farms, unremarkable to the point of embarrassment. Ethel herself would later describe it, under oath, as ordinary and very ugly. Yet it was the less impressive house that mattered most in Dorrance's calculations. He kept his voting registration in New Jersey. His driver's license was issued there. He continued banking there. His lawyers operated there. When he drew up his will, he identified himself as a resident of Burlington County and instructed his executives to file the estate in New Jersey. It was not a casual arrangement. It was a legal architecture built around a fiction, and like many fictions maintained by rich men, it was meticulous in form and absurd in substance. The evidence of actual life pointed in only one direction. Before the move, the Cinnaminson property employed a substantial domestic staff. Afterward, the number fell sharply. Once his mother and sister died there, it shrank further. Household expenditures at the New Jersey home collapsed. Utility usage became almost comically low. The monthly gas and electric bill reportedly hovered around $7, a figure so small it would later read less like accounting than satire. Dorrance still visited from time to time. The property stood near Campbell's experimental tomato fields, and he had reasons to appear there. But he did not live there in any serious sense. He lived at Woodcrest. His family lived at Woodcrest. His life had moved to Pennsylvania. Everything else was staging. At night, he sat in a house meant for another order of wealth, presiding over a company that grew richer by the quarter and guarding it with the same instincts that had built it. He drank heavily, a habit that would cast a long shadow inside the family. He also refused to let outsiders into the ownership structure. Bankers dreamed of taking Campbell public. A business of that size, that recognizability, that profitability would have been an offering. None of them got anywhere. Dorrance wanted no outside shareholders, no dilution, no scrutiny that did not serve him. He would maintain an almost empty house, preserve a flimsy legal identity, and sign a 35-page will rather than surrender control or expose the fortune to unnecessary claims. He was 56 years old, living in one house, pretending to belong to another, and building a structure of paper around an empire made of soup. It was clever, it was disciplined, it was in character, and it was already on its way to becoming the expensive miscalculation of his life. John Thompson Dorrance died on the 21st of September, 1930, at 56, of heart disease. There was an irony so sharp it needed no embellishment. He did not die in the grand Pennsylvania estate that had come to represent his real life. He died in the smaller New Jersey house he had spent years insisting was still his legal home. That summer, the family had been in Bar Harbor, where they maintained another residence. When they returned in autumn, Woodcrest was being readied for the season, and Dorrance stopped in Cinnaminson, the property his wife had once described as ordinary and ugly. It was there, in the house preserved less for comfort than for strategy, that his heart failed. His executives moved quickly. The will was filed for probate in Burlington County, New Jersey. The papers identified him as a resident of Cinnaminson Township. His brother Arthur assumed the presidency of Campbell. The body crossed back into Pennsylvania for burial at West Laurel Hill. Then the governments began to act. Pennsylvania moved first. The Commonwealth argued that Dorrance had been a Pennsylvania man since 1925. When his family shifted its center of life to Woodcrest, it appointed an appraiser, valued the estate at just under $200 million, and assessed a staggering inheritance tax. Dorrance's representatives challenged the claim and initially won. A lower court accepted the argument that his domicile remained New Jersey. For a moment, the fiction held. Then the Pennsylvania Supreme Court took a colder view. In 1932, it reversed the earlier ruling and found that Dorrance had been domiciled in Pennsylvania after all. The reasoning was devastating because it was so simple. Courts, when they choose to be unsentimental, reduce wealth to facts. There was the 51-room house in Radnor. There were the servants, the children in local schools, the family's social life conducted from Pennsylvania drawing rooms and lawns. Against that reality, his documents meant little. Licenses could be renewed, voter rolls could be maintained, lawyers could draft language. But conduct, the court made clear, carried more weight than paperwork. A man lives where he lives. The estate sought relief from the United States Supreme Court. It declined to interfere. Pennsylvania collected more than $14 million, plus interest. For most families, that would have ended the matter. For the Dorrance estate, it was only the opening loss. New Jersey then asserted its own claim. Its evidence was not imaginary. Dorrance had voted there, banked there, run his company from Camden, and identified himself in his testamentary papers as a citizen of that state. To New Jersey, Pennsylvania's victory settled nothing except Pennsylvania's appetite. New Jersey had a right to decide where the dead man belonged. Its tax commissioner assessed another inheritance levy based on an estate valuation exceeding $115 million. The executors protested on grounds that bordered on common sense. A man should not be taxed twice for dying once. But common sense and tax law do not always keep the same company. New Jersey's courts upheld the assessment. Its highest court agreed that Pennsylvania's judgment did not bind New Jersey, because domicile was a question each state could answer for itself. The estate returned to Washington one more time, hoping the federal judiciary would stop what looked absurd. In December 1935, the Supreme Court refused again. Justice Louis Brandeis made clear that federal courts would not step in to block a state tax matter already moving through state tribunals, and so the impossible became official. John Thompson Dorrance, who had spent the last years of his life maintaining a duplicate residence to reduce the tax burden on his heirs, was treated in death as belonging fully to two states at once. Pennsylvania took more than 14 million. New Jersey took more than 12 million. Together, the bill exceeded $26 million. Had he simply chosen one jurisdiction and established it honestly, the family's liability would likely have been far lower. The strategy designed to preserve the fortune had instead enlarged the penalty. The case entered American legal history not because it was elegant, but because it was useful. It became a warning taught in classrooms, cited in opinions, and repeated by estate lawyers to clients who believed a second address and a few forms could overcome reality. The Dorrance litigation established a durable lesson. Two states may each decide that a dead man was theirs, and neither is required to yield merely because the other got there first. There was a grim symmetry in it. Dorrance had built his empire by removing what was inefficient. He took water out of soup, clutter out of the product line, and eventually partners out of the ownership structure. His genius lay in subtraction, yet in the architecture of his own fortune, he added one unnecessary thing: a second home, preserved not for living, but for legal theatre. That single addition multiplied the cost of his death. What he left behind was not merely a company and not merely an estate. He left a governing instrument. The will waiting behind this tax war would do more than distribute money. It would set terms, assign power, and bind descendants who had not chosen any of it. If the tax case exposed the price of Dorrance's deception, the document that followed would reveal something even more lasting: his determination to control the family from beyond the grave. The will was opened in Mount Holly, New Jersey, but what emerged from it was less an act of inheritance than a blueprint for command. On paper, John Thompson Dorrance had divided his estate into 6 portions. His widow, Ethel, was assigned 1/4. His only son, John Jr., known within the family as Jack, received another 1/4, along with 2 deeply symbolic possessions: his father's personal library and a grandfather clock, objects that suggested continuity, education, and time itself passing under supervision. The 4 daughters, Eleanor, Ethel, Charlotte, and Margaret, were each given 1/8. Even the smallest of those fractions represented a degree of wealth most Americans could scarcely imagine. At the time, the estate was valued at roughly $150 million, a private fortune vast enough to distort the lives of everyone who touched it. But the real subject of the will was not cash, it was control of Campbell. Dorrance had spent his life refusing outside ownership, rejecting dilution, and concentrating power in his own hands with almost doctrinal discipline. He had no intention of surrendering that principle merely because he was dead. The language he left behind made his wishes unmistakable. The company's stock was not to be sold except under the most extraordinary circumstances, and even then only after exhaustive deliberation. If a sale ever became unavoidable, it was not to happen gradually, not in fragments, not through the quiet erosion of family influence. Every share was to move at once, in a single block, so that no outsider could slip in piece by piece and acquire leverage over the company his name had built. That alone would have been restrictive. He went further. The stock was not simply passed down as ordinary property to be absorbed into marriages, scattered among in-laws, or liquidated to suit individual preference. He designed a chain of succession meant to preserve the family's grip across generations. When his children died, their holdings would pass to their children, his grandchildren, but not on equal moral terms. The branch descending from Jack, the only son and bearer of the Dorrance name, was structured to receive twice what would go to the descendants of each daughter. The arithmetic was legal. The meaning was dynastic. He was preserving not merely ownership, but hierarchy. The line he considered central would remain central. Even his insistence on New Jersey residency had served more than one purpose. Taxes were only part of it. Under Pennsylvania law, a widow was entitled to a larger, mandatory share of her husband's personal estate, regardless of his preferences. New Jersey offered no such protection. By sustaining the fiction that he remained domiciled there, Dorrance ensured that Ethel would receive only what he chose to allow, and nothing beyond it. Before his death, he had even asked her to sign a statement affirming that New Jersey was their legal home. It was a final act of management disguised as paperwork, so the document was not generous in spirit. Whatever its numbers may have suggested, it was managerial, strategic, almost architectural. It determined who would hold the wealth, under what conditions, in what proportions, and with what limitations. It anticipated disagreement and attempted to prevent it. It assumed drift and tried to outlaw it. It reached forward into lives not yet formed and assigned obligations in advance. This is what makes certain old American fortunes feel less like inheritances than systems of rule. The money arrives wrapped in directives. The assets come attached to behavior. Children receive not freedom, but roles. The will did not simply distribute an empire after the founder's death. It recreated his presence inside the family, turning absence into authority and grief into a mechanism for obedience after burial. Jack was only 11 years old when this structure settled over him. A newspaper remarked that he was the closest thing America had to a hereditary nobleman, an observation that was not entirely frivolous. He had inherited a quarter of the largest privately controlled food company in the country, the library of a dead industrial patriarch, a clock marking the continuity of the house, and a doctrine he had no part in writing. The fortune was enormous. The liberty within it was not. The child who inherited Campbell did not grow up under the illusion that his life was his own. From an early age, John T. Dorrance Jr. Jack understood that he belonged to a family whose wealth attracted not admiration alone, but danger. At Princeton, he drove a car equipped with tear gas protection against kidnapping, a detail suited to the anxieties of American dynastic money. Later, as chairman of Campbell, he varied his route to the office and moved under guard. Wealth was never merely comfort. It was exposure. Jack arrived at adulthood with the credentials expected of his class. St. George's in Newport, then Princeton, where he studied geology and graduated in 1941. War interrupted inheritance. He joined the Army Signal Corps, served in China, and rose from enlisted man to captain. For a time, the demands placed upon him came from outside the family. Then the war ended, and the older obligations resumed. He was sent to Camden, to the factory floor, not as a prince ascending a throne, but as an heir being tested for usefulness. His father's will had left him ownership, but not direct command. The elder Dorrance understood that family control and executive leadership were not the same thing. Campbell remained under the authority of Jack's uncle first, and then under professional managers from outside the bloodline. Jack worked his way through the enterprise with patience that may have been discipline or resignation. He served in operational roles, financial roles, support roles close enough to power to understand it, but not yet to embody it. When he became chairman in 1962, it was less a coronation than an acknowledgement that he had endured the apprenticeship expected of him. He would remain in that post for 22 years. The company evolved under his watch, entering public markets, broadening beyond its original core, extending its reach into new categories and geographies. But Jack was not remembered as an architect in the mold of his father. He was something quieter and, in certain ways, sadder, a steward. He protected what had already been built. He maintained the inheritance. He carried the structure forward without pretending it had begun with him. Those who knew him sensed the discomfort beneath the privilege. He had not created the fortune that defined his life. He had merely received it, and receipt can be its own burden. Riches, in his case, seem not to have produced ease so much as self-consciousness. There was pleasure in it, but also embarrassment, caution, and a chronic awareness that he was living inside a scale of wealth he had done nothing to invent. His private life followed the familiar pattern of dynastic discretion: marriage, divorce, remarriage, mainline residence, guarded silence. He had 3 children, John III, called Ippy, and the younger 2, Mary Alice and Bennett, but told them little about the company and even less about the fortune awaiting them. Their photographs were kept out of yearbooks. Public visibility was treated as risk. Privacy became family policy. Like his father, Jack drank. In 1984, he startled shareholders by announcing that he would step down as chairman. Even then, he did not disappear. He remained on the board and continued to move through headquarters as a man who had never really been permitted to leave. 5 years later, in 1989, he died of a heart attack at his home on the main line, 70 years old. With his death, the structure built by his father finally shifted. His 3 children moved from receiving controlled distributions to owning roughly a third of Campbell itself. The old will had reached its next generation. Late in life, Jack Dorrance seems to have understood that inheritance alone was no longer enough. Wealth could be transferred by trust, document, and board seat, but cohesion could not. In March 1989, he gathered the next generation at Greenbrier in West Virginia, a resort where power has long preferred to rehearse itself behind polished wood. The gathering was part reunion, part orientation, part warning. His children, nieces, and nephews toured operations, met executives, and asked the kinds of questions heirs ask when they are trying to determine whether what they own is still alive or merely expensive. For the first time, Jack allowed himself to believe the family might remain intact. Less than 2 weeks later, he was dead. What he left behind was not a united house, but a coalition under strain. The 9 Dorrance cousins who controlled a majority of Campbell were bound by blood and divided by history. They belonged to 3 branches of the family, each with its own grievances and ambitions. Jack's children, Ippy, Mary Alice, and Bennett, held the strongest combined position. Another branch commanded a smaller but substantial stake. The remaining branch occupied the uneasy middle. On paper, all were rich. Much of that wealth remained trapped inside Campbell's stock, valuable in theory, restrictive in use, and difficult to unwind without damaging the thing itself. That was the paradox at the center of the dynasty. The shares made them powerful, but they also made them prisoners of one another. Campbell's performance had softened after years of strategic drift. Expansion had not produced the returns some family members expected, and a company that once looked immovable had begun to feel vulnerable. Any cousin who wanted liquidity faced a brutal arithmetic. Sell too many shares individually, and the market price would suffer. Preserve the value, and the only serious option was to sell the company whole. The danger did not announce itself at first as betrayal. It arrived the way many elite transactions do, casually, socially. On a ski trip in Vail, a family conversation about Campbell's leadership drifted toward possibility. From that conversation came a more serious idea, and soon a covert merger plan was taking shape. Inside the family, it became known as Project Toad, a name unserious enough to disguise how consequential it was. Had it gone through, Campbell would have been combined with Quaker Oats, but scale was not the true issue. Control was. Headquarters would move to Chicago. The Dorrances would cease to be the dominant force in the company that bore the mark of their grandfather's will. When Bennett and their cousin George Strawbridge discovered that discussions were advancing without their approval, they acted immediately. A conference call was placed to the chairman, and the proposal was stopped before it could mature into fact. Project Toad died quickly. The family rupture did not. If anything, the failed plan clarified the division. Some heirs wanted patience and continuity. Others wanted an exit at full value, and were increasingly willing to force one. The next move came in public filings. 3 dissident family groups, together holding 17% of the company, signaled their readiness to sell. They retained Arthur Lyman, the Manhattan lawyer known for his role in the Iran-Contra hearings, and sent him to Camden with a message of coldness. Either management found a way to satisfy the dissatisfied branches, or the pressure for a sale would intensify. It was the language of corporate combat. But beneath it sat something older, the spectacle of a family threatening its own inheritance. Jack's children did not yield. Between them, they held enough stock to block a transaction. Yet preventing a sale was not the same as restoring confidence. The company still needed repair, and the family needed someone not born into the feud to undertake it. In late 1989, the board turned to David W. Johnson, an Australian-born executive with a reputation for turnarounds. At Campbell, he moved with clarity. Weak businesses were cut, operations were tightened, performance began to improve. Within 2 years, earnings had strengthened enough to quiet the rebellion. The dissidents had not become believers, but the emergency had passed. For the moment, the structure still held together. Ippy, Mary Alice, and Bennett had honored the command written into their grandfather's estate decades earlier. Hold the shares, resist fragmentation, do not surrender the company because the family has grown tired of carrying it. But dynasties rarely resolve their tensions in a single boardroom season. The greatest surprise was still ahead, and it would come not from the cousins who wanted out, but from the son who had fought hardest to keep the house intact, the Wyoming rancher who would soon confront the logic beneath the argument over Campbell itself. Not soup, not sentiment, but the tax burden of enormous inherited wealth. John T. Dorrance III was not shaped for boardrooms, at least not at first. If anything, he seemed to move in the opposite direction, away from Camden, away from Philadelphia drawing rooms, away from the suffocating choreography of dynastic expectation. His parents separated when he was still young, and by 19 he had been carried with his mother to Switzerland, into a life that stood at a polite distance from the American inheritance, waiting behind his name. He later returned to the United States, enrolled at the University of Arizona, and studied business. But what followed was not the usual apprenticeship of an heir. He vanished into the West. In eastern Wyoming, near Devil's Tower, he bought land 18,000 acres of grass, weather, silence, and usable distance. It was the kind of landscape that seemed to promise escape from lineage itself. There he built a ranching life under the brand IPY, drawn from the childhood nickname that had clung to him after he once tried to pronounce the Roman numeral at the end of his name. The name stuck because it sounded accidental. The life he constructed around it did not. For 15 years he lived as a cattleman, raising Brangus stock, marrying, fathering 2 sons, and inhabiting a 3-story chalet, decorated not in old money restraint, but in the rough trophies of Western self-invention. It was a world apart from Campbell's. He was comfortable, certainly, but not rich in the theatrical sense attached to the Dorrance bloodline. The trust from his father provided him with substantial quarterly income, enough to live well by any normal standard, but it remained only a measured allowance when set beside the sealed magnitude of the family fortune. That changed in an instant in 1989. When Jack Dorrance died, the structure built by the grandfather's will shifted again, and Ippy's financial life was transformed overnight. The stock he now held directly was worth hundreds of millions. Dividend income alone rose to a level so extreme it no longer resembled salary, inheritance, or even conventional wealth. It became a private revenue stream on the scale of a sovereign estate. The rancher, who had tried to stand outside the family machine, discovered that he had, in fact, inherited one of its central gears. What surprised people was not that he accepted the role, but the force with which he entered it. Once on Campbell's board, he proved neither ornamental nor passive. He was intense, restless, and more serious than many expected. He traveled at his own expense to inspect overseas operations, showing up in places like Hong Kong, Spain, and Argentina, with the concentration of a man who had decided that ownership, if it was going to define him, would at least be examined firsthand. Directors who had assumed they were dealing with a Western eccentric encountered something else: conviction. For him, the matter had become personal in a way that was larger than corporate governance. He had fought to keep Campbell inside the family during the struggle that followed his father's death. He had helped prevent the company from slipping into outside hands. But victory carried its own dreadful arithmetic. The same inheritance that gave him power also exposed him to the brutal logic of the American estate tax. If he died holding that fortune as an American citizen, the government would claim more than half. In that realization, the old family drama sharpened into something colder. The ranch had been an escape. The money, as always, was not. For a Dorrance, when inheritance began to resemble confiscation, even citizenship could start to look disturbingly flexible. For Ippy Dorrance, the problem was not emotional before it was mathematical. The numbers came first, cold and unembarrassed. Under the estate tax regime then in force, the federal government would eventually claim more than half of what he intended to leave behind. On a fortune measured not in comfortable millions but in the upper reaches of dynastic wealth, that was not a trimming of excess. It was an amputation. The family had seen a version of this before. His grandfather had tried to outmaneuver inheritance law by preserving a legal residence that barely functioned as a home. The maneuver had failed, and the cost had been staggering. Ippy drew the lesson differently. He would not maintain a fiction inside the United States. He would step outside it. In the early 1990s, he began constructing an exit with the same seriousness other men reserve for acquisitions or wars. Ireland offered a path. The country's law, at the time, allowed foreign nationals who made qualifying investments to seek citizenship. Dorrance invested $1.5 million in forestry, planting trees across roughly 1,000 acres. It was a curiously pastoral threshold into expatriation, a fortune shielded by soil and timber. But the motive was neither sentimental nor ecological. It was structural. He was not moving toward Ireland because he belonged there in any inherited sense. He was moving toward a tax regime that would not devour the estate his children stood to receive. In 1995, he appeared before an Irish judge, pledged allegiance, and became a citizen of the Republic of Ireland. The ceremony was brief. Its consequences were not. Afterward, he walked into the American embassy in Dublin and renounced his United States citizenship. There is something almost theatrically modern about that image. An heir to an old American food fortune, standing in a diplomatic office, surrendering nationality with a signature because the arithmetic of inheritance had made patriotism look financially irrational. His grandfather had tried to cheat geography. Ippy severed it. The choice was exacting, not symbolic. Ireland's transfer tax burden was vastly lighter. America, by contrast, now became a country he could not inhabit too freely without risking the return of the tax status he had just spent years escaping. He could still see Wyoming, where he had already moved ranch assets to his sons. He could still appear in Camden when corporate duties required it. But the border had acquired fiscal meaning. Time spent on American soil had to be counted. Presence itself had become expensive. In November 1996, he sold his Campbell holdings in a transaction worth $720 million. The sale severed him from the company as an owner, but not from the dynasty that had produced him. He settled into a Georgian townhouse in Dublin and kept winter quarters in the Bahamas, adopting the geography of global wealth with the quiet decisiveness of a man who understood that privacy improves. Once one stops explaining oneself, publicly, he faded. Politically, he detonated. Washington reacted with rage, sharpened by class resentment. Here was no refugee fleeing coercion, scarcity, or ideology. He was a beneficiary of American capitalism leaving because its tax code had become intolerable to him. Members of Congress attacked him by name. The Clinton administration moved toward measures designed to punish precisely this maneuver. The wealthy citizen who departs not from necessity, but from calculation. Dorrance became a symbol larger than himself. An example used in arguments about patriotism, obligation, and whether a republic should permit its richest heirs to carry their fortunes offshore while keeping the benefits of access and status. Yet the most revealing aspect of the episode was not political outrage. It was continuity. The instinct was recognizably ancestral. 65 years earlier, an older John T. Dorrance had tried to protect family wealth with a false domestic address and ended up paying twice. The grandson, inheriting both the money and the lesson, chose a broader stage. He did not keep a spare house. He relinquished a country. The scale had changed. The reflex had not. While Ippy was loosening his ties to the United States, his sister was tightening hers. Mary Alice Dorrance Malone made the opposite decision in almost every visible way. She stayed in Pennsylvania, she remained inside the company, and she anchored herself to an older world of land, discipline, breeding, and repetition, the world of horses. If Ippy's story carried the modern chill of tax arbitrage and international mobility, Mary Alice's carried the more traditional atmosphere of landed American wealth. Hedged fields, long routines, a private competence mistaken by outsiders for ease. Born in 1950, the middle child of Jack Dorrance and his wife Angeline, she grew up in Chester County, where the terrain itself seems arranged to flatter lineage. Farms, stone houses, paddocks, and old institutions formed the background of her life. Horses entered early and did not leave. What began as childhood devotion matured into professional seriousness. By early adulthood, she was training riders, building programs, organizing clubs, and learning the deeper architecture of equestrian culture, where pedigree, patience, and exacting standards matter as much as spectacle. In 1976, she founded Iron Spring Farm in Coatesville, and from that point forward, she began altering American dressage in a way that only those inside the sport fully understood. At the time, elite European bloodlines were not easily available to American breeders. Mary Alice helped change that. She imported Dutch warm-blood stallions, and over the decades that followed, built one of the most respected breeding and training operations in the country. The names became fixtures within the sport. The horses won, reproduced, influenced, and established reputations that outlived individual seasons. Iron Spring Farm was not a hobby draped in inherited money. It was a serious program, run with the patience of someone who understood that excellence in horse breeding resembles dynasty more than business. One works for results that may not fully appear until years later, and then only if discipline has been maintained in the bloodline. Mary Alice was not merely an owner watching from the rail. She competed, she trained, she earned national honors, and helped prove that American-bred horses could stand on stages that had long favored Europe. Over time, the farm expanded, its reach extending from Pennsylvania to a winter base in Florida, and the horses associated with her program appeared at the Olympics, Paralympics, World Cup finals, and other elite events across the international circuit. The enterprise had glamour at a distance, but up close it was labor, judgment, and endurance. Still, horses were only one half of her inheritance. The other sat in Camden. In 1990, 1 year after her father's death, Mary Alice joined the Campbell board. She would remain there for decades, longer than any director in the company's history. Her stake made her the largest individual shareholder. Her public style, however, was nearly anti-theatrical. She gave few interviews, issued almost no personal commentary, and treated publicity the way old families often treat it, as something to be managed by withholding. Inside the company, her role was not ornamental, it was structural. As long as she held her shares and occupied her seat, the Dorrance family's influence remained consolidated. She did not have to dominate a room to affect it. Presence was enough. That reserve held even when scandal brushed close. When a former employee and travel companion attempted to extort her, threatening to publish an intimate account unless paid, Mary Alice did not dramatize the episode. She referred it to authorities, allowed the law to proceed, and said nothing in public. The silence was not emptiness, it was policy. In families of this type, discretion is less a courtesy than a survival technique. To speak is to enlarge the event. To decline speech is to reduce it back to paperwork. She raised 2 daughters in the same Pennsylvania landscape that had formed her, among fields and horse country and the quiet habits of guarded affluence. When she died at home in 2025, the official tributes emphasized service, steadiness, and historical knowledge. That language, restrained as it was, pointed to the truth. She had been one of the invisible, load-bearing walls of the dynasty. Within weeks, her eldest daughter took her place on the board. The transfer occurred with almost aristocratic smoothness. The seat moved from mother to daughter the way a responsibility moves through an old house, not because sentiment demands it, but because continuity does. That may be the most revealing contrast between the siblings. Ippy treated the family fortune as something to defend by mobility, jurisdiction, and escape. Mary Alice treated it as something to defend by remaining in place. He crossed borders. She held ground. He converted inheritance into distance. She converted it into stewardship. Both, in their own way, obeyed the same old commandment written into the family structure long before either of them was old enough to understand it. Preserve what was handed down, and do not be the generation that loses it. For everyone who followed, Bennett Dorrance was the youngest of Jack's 3 children and the easiest to overlook. He did not cultivate the aura of an international horsewoman. He did not make headlines by surrendering an American passport. He did not seem interested in turning inheritance into theater. After college, he went west, settled in Arizona, and built a life that appeared to have slipped free of the family script. In the early 1980s, he co-founded DMB Associates in Scottsdale, a real estate development firm that specialized in master-planned communities and commercial projects across the Southwest. It was prosperous and credible, with its own logic and its own measure of success. Soup had nothing to do with it. Yet Bennett understood something many heirs resist until it is too late. Dynastic wealth does not maintain itself simply because the assets are large. Money can survive neglect for a while. Control usually cannot. By the time he joined the Campbell board in 1989, the year his father died, the company was moving through one of the most delicate periods in its history. The family voting structure was weakening. Some cousins wanted liquidity, others wanted continuity. A covert merger plan had only been stopped. The old consensus, such as it was, had begun to fray. Bennett arrived in Camden not as a conqueror, not as a visionary executive with a grand strategy, but as something less glamorous and, in families like this, far more necessary, a stabilizer. He owned a significant stake, but what mattered was not simply the size of it was the way he used it. Bennett's power was conversational rather than theatrical. He did not dominate headlines, issue manifestos, or treat the boardroom as a stage for personal style. He made calls, he listened, he arranged meetings before tensions hardened into factions. He worked to keep the family's holdings moving in rough alignment rather than breaking apart into resentments. In the mid-1990s, speaking at a family enterprise gathering, he described himself with a phrase so unadorned it almost concealed its importance. The default leader. No one else wanted the role, he said. No one else was positioned to do it. The description was not self-glorifying. It was diagnostic. By then, the alternatives were plain. Ippy had chosen distance geographic, legal, almost philosophical. Mary Alice remained deeply committed, but her attention was divided between Camden and the exacting world of horses. The wider network of cousins was scattered across branches of the family tree, some disengaged, some impatient, some actively suspicious of one another. Under those conditions, unity does not happen by sentiment. It has to be serviced. Bennett became the one who handled that labor, the unspectacular work of preventing family capital from becoming family fragmentation. He did this largely from Paradise Valley, a wealthy but discreet enclave against Camelback Mountain, where comfort could be enjoyed without much explanation. His life there was affluent, certainly, but curiously recessive in style. He did not pursue visibility with the appetite so many heirs mistake for relevance. When wealth rankings attached billion-dollar estimates to his name, he declined to perform either modesty or pride. He simply said nothing. Silence, in his case, was not mystery for its own sake. It was method. A quieter man can often carry more influence inside a family than a louder one, especially when the louder ones have already exhausted themselves. His service on Campbell's board lasted more than 3 decades. From 1989 to 2022, he appeared with the regularity of someone who understood that continuity is built not through inspiration, but through repetition. He attended the meetings, he reviewed the numbers, he consulted when consultation mattered, and withheld performance when performance would only distort the room. He was not known for public clashes with management or for sweeping declarations about the company's destiny. His influence worked differently, at decisive moments when strategic alternatives were floated, when activist investors pressed for transactions, when the temptation to trade permanence for a premium returned. Bennett was part of the family block that held the line. This kind of contribution rarely photographs well. It leaves no grand estate named after it, no legendary speech, no glittering mythology. There were no championship rosettes, no diplomatic ceremonies, no congressional denunciations. What Bennett provided was structure. For years, he occupied the middle ground between relatives who wanted to monetize the inheritance and relatives who wanted to preserve it at all costs, between the branches that had stopped caring enough and the ones that cared so much they became difficult. He turned up, kept talking, kept voting, kept the pieces from moving too far apart. In most dynasties, this is the labor no one celebrates until it is gone and the fractures become visible. In 2022, he stepped down from the board and passed the seat to his son, Bennett Dorrance Jr. The gesture echoed a broader pattern already forming within the family. A board chair, or directorship, moving from parent to child, less like a promotion than like the transfer of custodial duty in an old house. Mary Alice's branch would do the same. The mechanism mattered because it revealed how the dynasty now survived, not through a single commanding patriarch, but through distributed guardianship. Small acts of succession designed to keep the family name present wherever corporate authority still mattered. By the time Bennett handed over his seat, the Dorrances controlled far less of Campbell than they once had. Their ownership had fallen from a commanding majority to roughly a third. Yet a third, properly organized, was still enough. Enough to resist unwanted pressure. Enough to influence outcomes. Enough to remind Camden that the family which had built the company had not entirely loosened its grip. None of that was inevitable. It was the result of years of patient, largely invisible work, much of it done by the youngest of Jack Dorrance's children, from a house in Arizona, speaking into telephones, holding together a coalition that might otherwise have dissolved into money, grievance, and sale. In the summer of 1962, before the museums agreed on what he was, Andy Warhol carried 32 small paintings into the Ferris Gallery in Los Angeles and placed them on a narrow shelf, as if he were stocking a grocery aisle. He was 33 years old, still emerging from commercial illustration, still regarded by many in the art establishment as a draftsman rather than an artist. Each canvas showed a single Campbell's soup can, tomato, chicken noodle, cream of celery, pepper pot, one painting for each variety, then sold by the company. Together, they looked less like a reverent exhibition than an inventory. The effect was unnerving because it was so plain. Across the street, a rival gallery mocked the show by displaying actual cans and offering them for sale at supermarket price. Critics, when they bothered to take the work seriously, tended to treat it as a provocation, with no lasting substance, an advertising joke, a stunt built on banality, a trivial insult to painting. The early market agreed. The works did not fly off the wall. Irving Blum chose to keep the set together himself. He paid a sum that would later seem fictional in its modesty. Decades afterward, the collection would enter the Museum of Modern Art for millions. And by then, the joke had become American scripture. Warhol's choice of subject was not arbitrary. He gravitated toward the can because it was familiar to the point of invisibility, the kind of object that had slipped so deeply into daily life that most people no longer noticed its design. He understood that familiarity can become a form of power when moved into the wrong room. On the shelf of a pantry, a soup can is a convenience. Under gallery lights, repeated with near-mechanical consistency, it becomes a test. The question Warhol posed was not decorative, it was foundational. What separates merchandise from symbol? When does repetition stop being commerce and begin to look like ritual? At what point does an object become American enough to function as myth? Before Warhol, post-war painting belonged to the cult of gesture, the brushstroke as evidence of feeling, the canvas as a record of inner struggle, the artist as heroic personality. Warhol rejected that entire theater. He worked with the cool exactitude of the commercial world that had trained him. Projected image, traced line, flattened surface, minimal evidence of touch. The paintings looked as if the hand had almost disappeared. That was the point. If modern life was being organized by replication, branding, packaging, and mechanical sameness, then art, he implied, had no business pretending otherwise. The Campbell's can was not beneath painting. It was the truest available subject. What he almost certainly did not know, or perhaps did not need to know, was that the label he elevated carried a buried history of ambition, accident, and corporate self-invention. The red and white scheme had been chosen at the end of the 19th century after a company executive admired the colors at a college football game. The small medal pressed into the center of the label commemorated a prize won in Paris in 1900. By the time Warhol painted it, those decisions were already old. The design had survived into the mid-century with unnatural stability, unchanged enough to feel less designed than ordained. It had become one of those rare commercial surfaces that seemed to have escaped time while continuing to profit from it. That is part of what made the paintings so potent. Warhol was taking an object born in industry and revealing that it had already acquired the authority of an emblem. The Campbell's can was not merely a container, it was branding so complete it had crossed into iconography. Its familiarity was national. Its silhouette was democratic. Rich and poor, urban and suburban, highbrow and indifferent, all of them knew it on sight. In that sense, the work did not transform the can so much as expose what it had quietly become. The irony deepened with age. In 1962, Campbell's was a thriving American company whose products sat in stores from coast to coast. Warhol, by contrast, was still forcing his way into cultural legitimacy. By the end of the century, the painted can had become more valuable, inch for inch, than the physical product that inspired it. A work derived from a 10-cent article of mass consumption entered the highest chambers of institutional art and stayed there. The copy eclipsed the commodity. The supermarket object became a museum relic. Even now, the afterimage remains peculiarly American. At Warhol's grave in Pennsylvania, visitors leave Campbell's soup cans instead of flowers. Most choose tomato. The gesture is absurd, affectionate, and strangely exact. It turns a consumer object into a votive offering, without ever abandoning the joke inside it. That doubleness would have pleased him. Warhol understood better than almost anyone that modern America prefers its symbols half serious, half ironic, sincere enough to matter, ironic enough to survive embarrassment. Somewhere between the factory and the gallery, between Camden and Manhattan, between the pantry shelf and the museum wall, the Campbell's can cease to be only packaging. It became image, relic, shorthand, and eventually inheritance of another kind. The Dorrances did not commission that transformation. They did not need to. Their product had learned how to speak in public without them, and once it did, it said something larger than soup. In November 2024, the company altered one of the most recognizable names in American commerce. Campbell Soup Company became simply the Campbell's Company. The change was slight enough to look cosmetic. One word removed, one apostrophe adjusted, a familiar corporate surface polished for a new era. But small revisions can reveal large truths. The business, John T. Dorrance, built around a single condensed can, had long since outgrown the product that made him rich. What remained was not a soup company in the old sense, but a broad, packaged food empire shaped by acquisition, category expansion, and the modern corporate hunger for scale. By then, annual revenue had climbed into the billions. The pantry portfolio stretched far beyond the red and white label that once defined the enterprise. Pepperidge Farm, Goldfish, V8, Swanson, Pace, Prego. Each acquisition moved the company farther from the purity of its founding idea and closer to the conglomerate model. The original can still sat on shelves, still recognizable at a glance, still carrying the authority of an object that had survived the century almost unchanged. But it was no longer the center of gravity. It had become something more durable than a flagship product. A relic still generating revenue inside an empire that no longer depended on it. And yet Camden remained Camden. The headquarters stayed in the same New Jersey city where a young chemist had once offered to work for almost nothing in exchange for the freedom to test a better formula. That continuity matters because, in corporate life, geography often disappears long before identity does. Campbell changed shape, acquired brands, and pursued growth in the language of modern business. But it never entirely severed the symbolic thread connecting the present corporation to the laboratory logic from which it began. The empire expanded. The origin story remained in place like a family portrait no redesign could remove. The Dorrances, meanwhile, no longer commanded the company as they once had. Time had done what tax law, succession, diversification, and sale always do to dynastic ownership. It thinned it. What had once been majority rule had been reduced to strategic influence. By the mid-2020s, the descendants of the inventor held roughly a third of the stock. A third can still resist pressure, shape board outcomes, and ensure that a name continues to carry weight long after legal dominance has faded. The structure endured because the family learned to substitute coordination for control. Bennett Dorrance Jr. had taken his father's place. After Mary Alice Malone's death, her daughter stepped into the chair her mother had occupied with such reserve. Ippy remained abroad, wealthy beyond measure and no longer an owner, yet still part of the family story through what he had inherited and renounced. Around them stretched a larger human map. Descendants dispersed across the United States, Ireland, and Europe, linked by blood, trusts, and a founder's instructions. Some had little connection to Camden beyond documents and distributions. Families that begin as households often end as networks. Wealth promises continuity, but it often produces dispersion. Where earlier generations gathered in person, later ones communicate through advisors, attorneys, trustees, and board packets. Affection becomes less reliable than structure. Personal memory gives way to governance. A dynasty that once felt like a household starts to resemble an institution. Still, the old command remained audible beneath every modernization. Do not sell. Do not surrender control. Pass the weight forward. That instruction had survived depressions, lawsuits, citizenship renunciations, boardroom unrest, and the steady dilution that follows every generation of births, deaths, marriages, and tax settlements. 3 generations had already answered it in different ways. The founder had concentrated ownership and refused outside intrusion. His son had served as steward rather than visionary. The 3rd generation divided geographically and temperamentally, one branch expatriate, one equestrian, one managerial, but each upheld the essential rule. Even when lifestyles diverged completely, the deeper instinct remained the same: preserve the family's claim, if it can be preserved at all. Now a 4th generation stands where earlier ones stood, inheriting not just capital, but a burden disguised as continuity. They did not write the will that shaped them. They did not choose the obligation attached to the stock, the board seats, the expectation that private sacrifice is the price of collective control. Yet that obligation persists because dynastic instructions rarely disappear on their own. They weaken only when someone finally refuses them, and refusal, inside families like this, is rarely clean. It costs money, influence, belonging, or all 3. Meanwhile, the can remains eerily unchanged. The familiar script still curves across the label. The old medal from Paris still sits in the center, like a decorative seal from another age. The colors still carry a century of recognition, with almost no effort. More than 120 years after Dorrance figured out how to subtract water and multiply profit, the object itself survives with a composure many families would envy, but the design has outlasted trends, management theories, and the people who turned it into a fortune. That may be the final irony. The product proved easier to preserve than the human arrangement built around it. So, the unresolved question is no longer whether Campbell can survive without being defined entirely by soup. It already has. The real question is whether the Dorrances can remain a meaningful family at the scale of wealth their ancestor created. For nearly a century, the company has been held together by documents, votes, habits of silence, and the inherited reflex to guard what was handed down. The fortune remains immense. The name still matters. The will still exerts pressure from the grave. But every generation turns preservation into a fresh negotiation between loyalty and self-interest, between stewardship and escape, between holding on and being held. The can has endured because it asks so little of itself. A dynasty is harder. It requires people, and people, unlike labels, do not remain unchanged for long.